Okay, so we've got a lot to talk about with China, so we're going to break this up into a few videos because there's a lot of important parts here, and this part of 19th century, especially China, shows up a lot on AP exams. All right, so where we left off with China, the Ming Dynasty. We talked about that, the brilliant dynasty that came after the Mongol period. The Ming Dynasty loses the Mandate of Heaven, and we talked about that before as well too. Over reliance on eunuchs, just generally poor leadership, and so wanting to live lives of luxury while eunuchs ran the country. The civil unrest, the Manchus, the Mings lose the Mandate of Heaven. Manchus are from the north. They're from like the head. If you think of China looking like a giant chicken here, they are from the head of the chicken, north of Korea. They are north of the Great Wall. They are called in to help and put down the rebellion. They come in and they put down the rebellion, but they switch sides and take over. So they end up taking over from the Ming Dynasty, and this will be the second time foreigners rule China. The first time, and I say like foreigners, like non-Han Chinese people, the first one being the Mongolian period, the Yuan Dynasty, Kublai Khan, and that stuff. So this is the second time that Han China will be ruled by a minority group. So Ming and then especially the Qing are going to prosper during European demand for Chinese goods. So whereas the Ottomans were struggling and suffering, the Chinese are going to be very successful, because of this new economic trade and because of things like the canal and all that stuff, at least at first. The canal came a little later, but whatever. They're going to benefit from European and American trade, at least at first, and then things are going to change. We already talked before about British tea. The addiction to things like tea and porcelain are basically killing slaves in Mexico mining silver. Silver was being put onto ships, and we talked about the quinta on the Spanish ships. 1/5 of all silver went to the Spanish king. The other 4/5, where did a lot of it end up? China. So you're like the Spanish monarch's going to make 1/5. The Chinese king will be making 4/5. So during this time period, China is incredibly prosperous. A lot of their wealth is being fueled by slavery in the New World. That is true, and the addiction of the Europeans to Chinese goods. So at first, everything seems great. How could things go wrong? All right, the Qing Dynasty, 1644 to 1911. 1911. That's in the 20th century. That's not that long ago. That's 100 years ago. The last dynasty of China is going to end in the 1911 period. And it's not going to go easily. We'll talk more about that later on. All right, so the Manchus originally were pastoral nomads, so almost like the Mongolians, but north of the Great Wall. Adopted Confucian ideas, and then, in their minds at least, learned how to be better Confucians than the Han Chinese. When they looked at the Ming and the failures of the Ming Dynasty and the reliance on eunuchs, they said, well, you are not good Confucians. We are better Confucians. Qing Dynasty basically translates to pure dynasty, whereas the Ming is the brilliant dynasty, right? They're bringing China out of the dark age of the Mongol period. The Qing Dynasty is the pure dynasty, the pure Confucian dynasty. They are going to be better Confucians than the Ming. So they take control over Korea, Mongolia, northern China. They fight a war with the Ming loyalists for about the first 40 years that they are in existence. So war with Ming loyalists till about 1680. Eventually, though, many of the Han people and other minority groups in China will support the Qing because they were fed up with the corruption of the Ming Dynasty. And here are these people who seem to have the Mandate of Heaven. They seem to be conquering China, and they are the pure dynasty. They are the correct Confucian rulers. All right, so they are going to be the last dynasty of China. Oh yeah, I put these pictures here. The Fu Manchu hairstyle that you may have heard before in your life. Fu Manchu was a sort of racist bad guy in Marvel Comics. He had that hairstyle. Fu Manchu is the same idea. All right, so Manchu Qing control. This is an important aspect because it's almost entirely copied from the Mongols. The Qing did their homework. When they conquered over, they looked at the Mongols and they said, okay, well, the Mongols had policies to keep themselves separate from the Han Chinese. Remember, the Mongols, small population, Han Chinese, massive population, and the Mongols were afraid that they would lose their cultural uniqueness. And so they made all these rules to maintain their cultural uniqueness, and then they didn't follow their own rules, and the Mongols largely adopted Chinese stuff to the point where it was hard to tell Mongol versus Han Chinese, and what was the point? So the Qing are going to look at the Mongols and say, hey, we're going to do everything you did, but we're going to do it better. And they try. They're going to try their best. They're going to do a better job than the Mongols. They're eventually fail, but they do better than the Mongols. We'll give them that. So things that the Manchus forbidden, and most of this, by the way, exact same as the Mongols. Intermarriage. If you were Manchu, you could not marry a Han person. If you were Han, you were not allowed to study the Manchu language. Obviously, the Manchus could learn whatever language they wanted, but Han people were forbidden from learning the special Manchu language. Remember, we're trying to keep things separate. The Manchus are better. They are the foreigners. They are the foreign minority that is in charge of the vast majority, 90+% of the country being Han. They are trying to maintain that separation. They lived in separate areas. Inside of the cities, there would be like inside of Chinese cities, there would be like a banner city, a barrack city inside of the main city where only Manchus were allowed. So the Han were forbidden from these special areas. Regular Han were forbidden from being in the army, at least at first. That will change over time. But originally, the Han were supposed to be separate from the military. All of this is to solidify the idea that foreigners are in charge of the country now. One thing that becomes forced onto the Han people is the Q hairstyle. That hairstyle had been part of Chinese culture in different regions for a long period of time, but the Q hairstyle with the shaved front and then the long ponytail in the back for men was forced. If you were Han Chinese, you were forced to have this hairstyle. And so 19th century, early 20th century, you see a lot of political cartoons in American culture or racist stereotypes, let's be honest, of Chinese people, and you oftentimes see this hairstyle. Keep in mind that that hairstyle was not a choice. That was a hairstyle that was forced onto Han Chinese men by the Manchus. The Manchus would be allowed to do whatever they want with their hairstyle. Han Chinese had to wear this hairstyle so you would be able to quickly identify people in public and say, you are lower than me by your hairstyle. So kind of like branding people in a way, less severe. Manchu armies fought for banners. The Mongols fought for tumans. They broke their armies up into tumans. The Manchus broke them up into banners, and this is for the exact same reason the Mongols did it, the exact same way Genghis Khan did it. Genghis Khan, he dyed horse ropes, different colors to basically break up all the different groups of his tumans, all of his different armies, regiments. The Qing dynasty, the Manchus, they used different colored uniforms and different flags, different banners, and these people would dress in their certain ways, and they basically were like divisions of the military, just like we have different divisions of our military to this day. And we don't just have armies from Ohio or armies from Michigan or wherever, just from the south. The Mongols and the Qing, they do the exact same thing. They break their military up. Why do they do this? Because it breaks up tribal groups, so you're less likely to have revolutions and rebellions. All right, so why were they doing all this stuff? The exact same reason the Mongols did. All right. So let's talk about a couple of rulers. This guy's important for one reason, really, because he writes a book that's pretty important, but his grandson's much more important. We'll talk more about him. So Kangxi rules from 1661 to 1722. So he's kind of like the rising period of the Qing dynasty. He's going to be a great conqueror, big military conquest, islands of Taiwan, which the Isle of Formosa, Taiwan, we'll talk more about that in the 20th century, Tibet, Central Asia, makes China much of what it is today in terms of size, actually a little bigger. So Qing China is huge. It's a monstrous thing. But, while he's famous for his conquering, Kangxi's also very famous because he writes a dictionary and encyclopedia. So, did he write it himself? I don't know. Obviously, he probably had help. But he gets accredited with it. So, Kangxi's encyclopedia, Kangxi's dictionary, he's uniting the people. And he also had scholarly pursuits along with his militaristic goals and desires. So, he's a pretty famous guy for these two things and also for being a great conqueror. However, more famous than him is his grandson, Qianlong. Qianlong's usually seen as the high point of the Qing dynasty. So Qianlong, 1736 to 1795, and after him, it's going to go down. He's usually seen as the height of the Qing dynasty. Take a look at this graph over here. So if you see on this graph here, China was already a very wealthy and powerful thing, and this is tracking historically as best as we can, so ownership of world GDP. At one point, they were in the mid-30s for controlling world wealth. They controlled, so if you look at the entire wealth of the entire world, right around the time period that Kangxi is, kicking off, or sorry, not Kangxi, Qianlong is kicking off, that is the height of them. They are controlling a vast majority of the world's wealth. Ignore this part for right now. In comparison to the United States of America, we hit our peak after World War II, when the rest of the world was destroyed, except for the United States of America, and our industrial capacity, where everybody else was trashed and was still recovering. We were number one there. We still were like, I don't know, 28%. Meanwhile, up here, they're in the mid 30s. China controlled a large amount of the world's wealth. And remember, Europeans were dumping silver, hard currency, into China in exchange for tea, in exchange for silk, in exchange for stuff that came from the natural world and it was easily replenishable. So China was incredibly profitable, and Qianlong existed during this time period and maintained it. So he's usually seen as the greatest emperor of the Qing dynasty. So great prosperity. He canceled tax collection oftentimes to obviously, get the favor of his own people, but also he didn't need it. Why would he bother taxing people when he didn't need their tax dollars? He had so much money just being dumped onto him by England and Spain and France and all these Europeans and Americans eventually. So, I mean, 1795, we're starting to form, the United States of America. So trade with Europe expands, and he has wide contact with the English. Very famously, Macartney goes and meets with the Qianlong. He goes and meets with him, and very famously, he refused to kowtow. Remember, kowtow was something in Chinese culture where if you were a foreign dignity and you were to go to the Middle Kingdom, right, you wanted to go to China, you had to basically tap your face on the floor to show that you were so far below the Emperor of China. England, when they send Macartney, he refuses to do this. He refuses to bow down and this is kind of showing the status of England, and also, the arrogance of the British Empire versus the arrogance of the Chinese Empire. These two people are going to butt heads. So his refusal to kowtow was a big moment in history. Qianlong humors the guy. They meet with him, and he also writes a letter then. So Qianlong will write a letter to the British monarch and basically just insulting the English. He says that you're a tiny barbarian nation on the other side of the world. You have a lot to learn about being a country. You have a lot to learn about being an empire. And, maybe if you play your cards right, one day you'll be a big boy like China. It's incredibly insulting. It's like he talks down to England. It's one of the greatest things you find online. It's one of the greatest things probably because he's very cultured and he's very political about it, but it's an incredibly insulting thing. So anyways, this shows the initial relationship. The initial relationship England shows up to China, and Qianlong is the power player. Even though England refuses to kowtow, he's incredibly wealthy. England has no authority over him. The Industrial Revolution is just beginning. There's no steamships yet. There's no giant cannons that he has to worry about. And so this tiny barbarian nation on the other side of the world wants to make a trade organization, trade agreement with China. What a joke. Things are going to change, obviously. Qianlong also had a neat idea called being culturally null. So null, like void, like nothing, right? So culturally null. So obviously he had culture, okay? Obviously, he's a Confucian himself. But when he was running China, he realized that the Chinese Empire is huge. It's this big country, a big swack of land. And while most people are Han Chinese and most people accepted Confucianism and Taoism and things like that, he also realized that not all of the people in his country shared the same beliefs. So sort of like how the Ottomans had the millet system, he is going to adopt the idea of culturally null for China. So he would make a law or make a ruling, and he would try to speak to people in their own language. So if you were Han, he would pass the law and he would pass the ruling, and he would have it written up in Confucian and Taoist-based justifications. And then that would be distributed to the Han people. If he wanted to make a ruling for the Mongol people, he would make the ruling and justify using Mongol culture and Mongol, shamanistic culture and Mongol beliefs in order to justify it to the Mongol people and say, it's the same rule, it's the same ruling. He's just saying this is, why we're doing it in your own terms. When he went to the Uyghur people who lived in Western China, he would use Islamic things. He would use quotations from the Quran, and he would use Hadith to justify his actions and his rulings. The Tibetans who were Buddhist, he would use Buddhist texts and Buddhist beliefs and sayings of the Buddha in order to justify his rulings and his laws. And as a result, he was able to control his multicultural empire. And while a lot of other people like Russia and the Ottomans were struggling with nationalism, Qianlong was kind of a success story because he played to other people's cultures and accepted them rather than tried to destroy them. So he was trying to be culturally null, which probably kept China around for a long time, or at least during his rule. And that's where we'll stop this video.